I now invite Dr. Shauna Ferris, Associate Professor and Program Coordinator for Women's and Gender Studies, to share more about their department.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm very happy to be coming at you today from Treaty 1 territory. And as a visitor to these lands, as Amber suggested earlier, I offer gratitude and respect to Indigenous nations. And I note my responsibility to acknowledge and address past and present colonial violence so that we can all move forward together in a good way. Next slide, please. So what is women's and gender studies? Well, we've already talked a little bit about what an interdiscipline is. Women's and gender studies is also a relatively new discipline, having been established at North American universities and colleges only in the past 40 years. So women's and gender studies is a product of feminist organizing that began long ago, but gained a lot of momentum through the women's and gay liberation movements, through the civil rights movement, also through the Black civil rights movement and the American Indian movement. Many of these movements overlapped to produce feminisms that we understand today and to establish women's and gender studies as a discipline. Some of you will know this already, and Dr. LeBeau-McGowan has already mentioned it a little bit, but I'll remind all of us that a few short decades ago, it was possible to do an entire university degree and read, look at, listen to, or otherwise regard only research, literature, art, music, or theater created by men. And here in North America, as in many places really, those male writers, creators, and researchers whose bodies of work we looked at back then were primarily white, middle class, or upper class, able-bodied, and cisgender folks. Cisgender meaning having been born with a body to match, that matched up with how they understood their gender, i.e. to be male or masculine. It was as though women, persons of any other race or color, and poor working class folks had never produced anything worthy of inquiry. Feminism and other deeply interconnected parts of social justice movements and organizing set out to address these are alarmingly unjust exclusions. Education is part of the process of moving a society toward more socially just ends. Thus, the insistence on a wider variety of sources for research, creative and literary works to study in any course across the university and certainly in the Faculty of Arts. And thus, the establishment of interdisciplines, such as women's and gender studies and the others that Dr. LeBeau-McGowan mentioned earlier. While the title of our discipline focuses on gender, many feminists have always known that the study of gender is only the beginning. How I live my life and experience both oppression and privilege as a woman, for example, is only part of my story. Structures of race, class, and bodily ability also influence how I understand myself and how others see and respond to me. My whiteness protects me from racial violence, but my womanness or femininity, perceived or real, puts me at a much higher risk of gendered violence, i.e. an attack on me just because I am a woman. My position as a university professor imbues my life with a lot of privilege, protecting me from poverty and the well-documented structures of oppression that result in many women workers being underpaid and horribly exploited. But again, being a professor doesn't protect me from gender-based harassment and violence. And I've experienced both in and outside of the university context, as many women have. And to be clear, if you look at the research, what we know, especially as a result of the #MeToo movements over the last 5 to 7 years, between 1 in 3 and 1 in 5 women report experiencing violence of some form that is connected to their gender or their sexuality. Given that we know that much of the violence that people experience goes underreported, I think we can assume that the prevalence of violence across any sector of society is quite common. But my professor privilege in this context enables me to recognize harassment for what it is, that I'm not to blame for it, and to teach and discuss with students how we might change things for the better going forward. In short, as Interpol Gruhl and Karen Kaplan write in one of the textbooks that we use in women's and gender studies, feminism is a set of responses to conditions of inequality. Next slide, please. So I won't repeat some of the very helpful things that Dr. Kossler from history has already said about when to declare a major and when, what kinds of degrees you want to take. I will say that these are offerings. You probably know this already, but I'll remind us all that one 13-week course is 3 credit hours. Every women's and gender studies course, except for our honors thesis, is 3 credit hours. And the honors thesis course, which you take in or around your 4th year of study, is 6 credits, so spanning, for example, the fall and the winter terms. There are currently no master's or PhD programs in women's and gender studies in the province of Manitoba, and this is the problem we in women's and gender studies have been working for years to address, but the work is still in progress. Next slide, please. So we have 2 introductory courses that also count as W or writing credits. One of those credits you need to graduate with an undergraduate degree from the University of Manitoba. So these are the courses where our faculty most often meet the students who declare women's and gender studies majors and minors. Students come in for the writing credit, but stay for the feminist social justice study. These are pretty big classes, 80 students. Our classes get smaller and more interactive as you proceed through the program. Our 2000 level courses likewise have no prerequisites, so you could treat that as an introductory course as well. And then those classes usually cap out at about 50, 30 at the next level at the 3000 level, and around 10 to 15 students in our courses thereafter. Next slide, please. So every women's and gender studies course considers how different structures of oppression and privilege operate to advantage or disadvantage groups and individuals. I love our current array of courses. These are many, but not all, of our current offerings. Our instructors are all experts in these fields, and feminist pedagogy, or teaching practices, is deeply interactive and student-focused. We're going to talk to you about everything from mom genes and various forms of desire, sex, and love, to understudied lesbians and trans histories and presence, to social justice organizing around the globe, to gender, race, and class implications of public transit, scientific inquiry, and environmental justice, to Black Lives Matter and the prison industrial complex, to colonization and violence against women. Come study with us. We'd love to have you. Next slide, please. So there are a number of unique opportunities we're able to offer our majors in women's and gender studies. The first that I'm going to talk about is our Feminist and Queer Editorial Collective that publishes a journal called FAQ every year and has done so for 10 years, except for the last couple because of COVID-related things that keep people from being able to meet effectively outside of class time. Basically, once someone has declared a women's and gender studies major and has taken a minimum of 2 courses, there's an opportunity to apply to become a member of the student editorial collective that publishes FAQ. The collective then puts together a call for papers and circulates it to students at the university, often in women's and gender studies classes, but in many classes across the university, inviting people to submit work that they've created in classes. This is one of the ways that we encourage our students to think beyond that kind of audience of one to whom we often think of writing when we create academic work, especially if we do it for a class or in school. And also lots of students choose for their submissions to do creative works or different kinds of artworks. So we do have 10 years worth of journals, and we are very much looking forward to getting issue number 11 out within the next year, we hope. The other thing that we're able to offer are paid student internships. These again are reserved for women's and gender studies majors. Folks have a chance to apply for these internships every September. Current internships, we're offering 2 with Mentoring Artists for Women's Art, which is a local arts-based organization, as the title indicates. We also very recently had an internship with Fernwood Publishing, but that stopped happening because they loved our student interns so much they hired them on full time and the internship went away. We'll check in with them again in another couple of years. Some of the other internships we've offered are at places like the Fort Garry Women's Center, Sunshine House, the Sexuality Education Resource Center, or CERC, the Manitoba Status of Women, that also turned into a full-time job for a former intern, and a few other places in this locally. We're in the process now of collaborating with other local feminist organizations to increase and diversify these kinds of opportunities. The purpose of these internships is to support our community partners and to deepen students' knowledge and experience of feminist work in our communities. And then finally, I'll briefly mention that occasionally we are able to find the funds to travel with our students to the Women's and Gender Studies A Recherche Feminist Conference, which happens every year at a larger event called Congress. So what you'll see in the top picture on the right is an image of Drs. Nancy Kang and Dr. Janice Dodd and myself with our honors students Oyinda, Jamie, and Adriana. And that was at the conference that happened at UBC in Vancouver that year in 2019. And then just below that, we have on the left images of our honor students, Joyce, Emily, and Sylvie with Dr. Janice Dodd in the audience at a performance by the award-winning and goddess-like really musician Buffy St. Marie, who's on stage at the Regina iteration of that national conference, and that happened in 2018. Picture on the top left on this slide, I'll just say we're very proud. The 10th launch for the FAQ journal, that's the editorial collective you see at the front of the room and the audience as they begin the launch, and then a number of different folks came up to read from their contributions to the journal. Final slide, please. So as many will remind you, you need to know where you're going when you leave university, though that's not always the reason that you're here. You are here for many reasons that have already been mentioned. I'm supposed to talk only a little bit about what our students have done, and I love to talk about all the wonderful things our students go on to do, but it's been suggested that I keep this part short. So social justice-oriented training, such as women's and gender studies, sets students up for a variety of opportunities after they graduate. Many of our students take up work at local outreach organizations here and elsewhere. Many also volunteer in social justice-oriented places and spaces here and elsewhere. Some students continue on to study in the areas noted on the right side of this slide. This summer, I've had the pleasure of hiring one of our former graduates who now has a master's degree and who will be teaching one of those introductory W courses I talked about earlier. And this past July, I received an exciting Instagram message from a women's and gender studies graduate who had just completed her training as an obstetrician and gynecologist. She credited her women's and gender studies degree, even after all that additional training, with continuing to shape her worldview. I could go on, but I'll stop there now. Maybe someday I'll be talking here about your accomplishments. Thank you.